Good morning and welcome to everyone. It sure is nice to be here today, especially after yesterday afternoon. At that point, I wondered what was going to happen. Anyway, did anybody have any damage or issues? Yeah, considering what it could have been, I think we're all very, very fortunate and thankful. Andrew, Charlie, Florence, Harvey, Irma, Katrina, Maria, and Michael. Notice I didn't add Gordon. Hurricanes with their resultant flooding, wind damage, loss of life, destructions of homes and businesses bring out sympathy from viewers who hear about and see the damage that other people have to deal with. Of course, if you've ever been through a hurricane or a tornado, an earthquake or a flood, or anything that upsets your life significantly, you not only have sympathy, but you also have empathy for others, for those people that are going through the disasters. Just the heavy winds that we had last year from Irma and the loss of power and the cleanup that was involved probably helped us to have a little bit more empathy for those who are dealing with what happened with Michael. Empathy, of course, is not limited to knowing how someone feels when they're going through something as devastating as a hurricane. We can have empathy for someone who's struggling with anything, to lose weight, to overcome depression, to find a job, to overcome an addiction, and so forth. Perhaps you are wondering why the topic of empathy is all that important. As I've studied the subject, I've come to believe that empathy may be one of the foundational principles that we all need to work on to be the best kings and priests that we can be in the world tomorrow. And it can't hurt for any of us to have a little more empathy for each other and our fellow man right now. Life isn't easy for anybody nowadays. Learning to become kings and priests obviously has many facets. So why did I choose to talk about empathy? Well, first of all, empathy spins off in almost every area of our lives. Without this quality, you can't be as effective as a king and priest as you can be if you do have empathy. Second, most of the skills we're going to need in the future can be put into practice in our lives right now. Today, I'd like to take a closer look at empathy and see how it's something we all want and need to develop to make ourselves more caring Christians and better kings and priests in the world tomorrow. One simple definition of empathy is identification with and understanding of another's situation, feelings, and motives. It can signify kindly concern aroused by the misfortune, affliction, or suffering of another. It is sympathetic, sad concern for someone in misfortune. It's the ability to be moved by someone else's experiences. Empathy doesn't mean that we've experienced everything ourselves, but it does mean that we're mentally able to project ourselves into another person's shoes, so to speak. It is a somewhat rare emotional ability to feel and express genuine concern for another person's sufferings, and this requires a high degree of emotional maturity. Sympathy is something that is assumed to be the same as empathy, but it's probably not the best synonym. Sympathy is a feeling of or expression of pity or sorrow for someone. Perhaps the word that comes closest to fulfilling the meaning of empathy is compassion. Compassion is a deep awareness of the suffering of someone, coupled with a wish to relieve it. Empathy is more than just saying, I feel your pain. To have empathy is more than just a feeling. It's what motivates us to comfort one another, to encourage one another, to support one another. Yes, we're all human and we all make mistakes, and we all need comforting and encouragement from others from time to time. And spiritually, empathy can be likened to agape, the outgoing love of God. Let's look at Matthew 14. Empathy should actually bring us to action as an example of what we see from Christ. Matthew 14, starting in 14. And when Jesus went out, he saw a great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them, and healed their sick. His compassion led him to take the time to heal the sick. And if we read the rest of the verses in this section, we can see the compassion also led him to feed the multitude. Verse 15. When it was evening, his disciples came to him, saying, This is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. But Jesus said to them, They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And we know what happened with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Continuing in verses 20 and 21. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of the fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. His compassion for people led him to do something about the situation. First by healing them, and then by feeding them. Empathy is what motivates us to change the golden rule into the platinum rule. Let's turn to Matthew 22, beginning in verse 36. We'll break into a question being asked by one of the Pharisees in an attempt to test Jesus. Matthew 22, verse 36. Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. He was quoting from Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. Verse 38, this is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Here he's quoting from Leviticus 19:18. Jesus said that the second great commandment was like the first. Loving others as much as we love ourselves is what God the Father and Jesus requires of us. To do that, we have to go beyond treating others the way we want to be treated. That's sometimes referred to as the golden rule. We have to treat others the way they want to be treated. That's what I've heard referred to as the platinum rule. This undoubtedly is what the real intent was of this instruction in Matthew. You see, the problem that can occur with the golden rule is the way we sometimes interpret it. Let's suppose I'm feeling sad, and since you like to go deep sea fishing, you decide to cheer me up and take me out on the Gulf since that would cheer you up. That's treating me as you would want to be treated. Well, the problem is, for me, if you take me deep sea fishing, I'm going to get sick. I'll still be sad and I'll be sick too. What you should do to cheer me up is to do something that I'm going to enjoy doing. That's the platinum rule. Empathy helps you understand that you don't want to do something for me if it's going to leave me worse off than before. Let's look at Matthew 7, verse 12. Whatever you want men to do to you, do also to them. If you don't want someone to make you sick, don't do something that might make them sick. You don't take them out on a boat if they're going to get motion sickness. Empathy is the golden rule in practice. It's putting the other person first because you're imagining how they feel. It's not just saying, I know how you feel, especially unless you've really experienced exactly what the person is going through. And if you have gone through what they're going through, empathy also means not playing one-upmanship. That's when someone tells you about their problem and you spin off into a story about you've had it worse. Or if they mention a trial that they're going through, you take over the conversation about how your trial was twice as bad. Maybe it was, but empathy means it's not all about us. Empathy means building the character to let the other person take center stage for a while. One article that I read some time ago was entitled Comfort by Comparison. It's not usually helpful. It turns the attention onto the other person and forces the person in need of comforting to have to respond to the other person's story. It's a wonderful feeling for us when we find someone that really knows what we're going through. And in many ways, it's an even more wonderful feeling when we find someone who's going through a trial because we understand it. Remember, we don't actually have to have gone through the exact same situation. We do have to have our focus on others to pick on what it must be like to go through that situation. For instance, in addition to having a better idea about what's going to go on in a great tribulation, after seeing the destruction that's been brought on by the hurricanes, do we understand a few things better now? From the examples of the devastation and trauma caused by hurricanes, earthquakes, tornadoes, we can get just a little taste of what mankind is going to be facing in the future. Let's look at Isaiah 2. The section we'll look at has a subheading in my Bible, The Day of the Lord. After describing what society has become like in verses 6 to 9, we'll pick up in verse 10, where the outcome of not always following God is revealed. Isaiah 2, verse 10. Enter into the rock and hide in the dust from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty. The lofty looks of a man shall be humbled. The haughtiness of men shall be bowed down, and the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. For that day of the Lord of hosts shall come upon everything proud and lofty, upon everything lifted up, and it shall be brought low. Verse 17, the loftiness of man shall be bowed down, and the haughtiness of man shall be brought low. The Lord alone will be exalted in that day, but the idols he shall utterly abolish. They shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth, from the terror of the Lord and the glory of his majesty, when he arises to shake the earth mightily. This is what is described in Revelation 6, verses 12 to 17 as the sixth seal. Revelation 6, starting in verse 12. I looked when he opened the sixth seal, and behold, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became like blood. And the stars of heaven fell to the earth, as a fig tree drops its late figs when it is shaken by a mighty wind. Then the sky receded as a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, Fall on us and hide from us the face of him who sits on the throne from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand? I believe we can probably understand better how fearful people are going to be as we go to their caves and lead them out. We can see how gentle we're going to have to be to help them. Seeing the destruction of those hurricanes I mentioned should help us understand at least a little bit about the feeling that people will be having. I believe that we can understand better how rough they will have had it and how worn out and weary they'll be and how much they will need our compassion. Is there anyone in this room that doesn't feel compassion for what the people in Puerto Rico have gone through for more than a year now? Those communities were, and what about all those communities that were wiped out by Michael? Many still don't have electricity. No lights, no showers, no way to get laundry or even water. Some weeks ago when we got home from church, we discovered that our power had gone out about 25 minutes earlier. It was only out for about an hour and a half, and the house never started to get hot. It crossed our minds how difficult it would be for us if the power didn't come on. To think about not having a home to go to would be mind-boggling. Our compassion for all mankind will probably be even greater as more of us have to face some of the severe trials on our own before God's kingdom is ushered in. While we can imagine what it feels like to live under difficult circumstances, probably few of us have ever lived under the exact circumstances ourselves that many people have had to go through recently. In my Bible, Hebrews 4, verses 14 to 16 has the heading, Our Compassionate High Priest. Hebrews 4, starting in verse 16. Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heaven, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but was in all points tempted as we are, yet without sin. Verse 16, let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. It shouldn't be necessary for us to have to go through everything to have compassion for those who have gone through something. Christ can empathize with our weaknesses, even though he never gave in to any of the temptations that he faced. Even though he was without sin, he's willing to help us, just as we should be willing and ready to help in the future, to help all mankind. As we should all know by now, it's what we do day in and day out to become part of our very character, and what God looks at when he checks our spiritual progress. This means that we can show empathy or compassion in ways that don't grab headlines. A while back, I read about a statement the loss prevention officer of Bell's department stores made. He pointed out that in a newspaper article that 47% of retail losses are due to employee theft, and that costs everyone else about $400 a year. Empathy means that you don't steal from anybody, and including where you work, because you know it not only hurts the store owner, but results in higher prices for other people. In addition, we should think about what it would be like to have to be a store owner and have someone steal from you. Empathy means you don't cheat on a test or copy homework. That's stealing, and you can imagine how you'd feel if someone stole from you like that. We're not supposed to take credit for something we don't do. You wouldn't want to be the person that did some work and find someone else claim that that was something that they did. You don't stay out late without calling home if you're going to be late. You can imagine how you would worry if you were the one at home and you don't want the other person to be worrying. Empathy keeps you from doing shoddy work that might be potentially risky. You can imagine who might be harmed by your indifference or negligence. I've used the example before about in World War II, a parachute manufacturer was having serious difficulty with quality control. One of 20 of the parachutes that he was making was failing. He finally found a way to get 100% defect-free parachutes. He required his employees to take random jumps. How much better and less time-consuming would it have been if employees had just been able to realize that someone might be depending on them to walk safely away from a crash, and those employees needed to make sure the parachutes were perfect to start with. Empathy keeps you from gossiping. You know you wouldn't want somebody telling stories about you, and you can imagine how painful that would be to you. Going back to the end of the Great Tribulation and the beginning of our efforts to help people get back on their feet, I'm reminded of a saying that I heard that I've come to realize is true in many areas of our life. We need to make sure that we keep in mind that it's important to teach me to be just like you. There will still be people. They will be tired, perhaps humbled, perhaps not. Some of us can be really hard cases at times. They'll definitely be ready for all the scary stuff to be over, but they're not necessarily going to be jumping up and down and waiting for us to say, or saying to us, we're here to show you how to live. They may be as anxious to resume their former lifestyle as the people in New Orleans were after the change from Katrina was cleared up. No, people won't care how much they know or how much we know. They'll care how much we care. We will have to comfort them first and earn their trust. Again, they won't care how much we know until they know how much we care. That's a saying that can apply to all of us. It summarizes that we may not even recognize at a conscious level, but we need to respond well to others so that they know that we really care about them. Let's look at Philippians 2. Philippians 2, starting at verse 3. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should look not only at your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Your attitude should be the same as that of Jesus Christ. In other words, we have to show them how much we care about them. God's Spirit imparts to us the desire to care for other people, to help with their needs. That's not something that comes naturally to us. What comes naturally to us is better explained by the common attitude of, it's all about me, or I'm worth it. Developing empathy moves us from the selfish feeling to an awareness of other people's needs and concerns. Let's turn to 1 John. 1 John 3, verses 17 to 19. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And by this we know that we are of the truth and shall assure our hearts before him. The problem that we face today is society as a whole does not have much compassion for others on a day-to-day basis. 2 Timothy 3 reminds us that those living in the last days will love themselves, boast, they'll refuse to love others or forgive them. These very attitudes can reach into our lives if we're not on guard. Those attitudes can cause us to say what's mine is mine. I'm not sharing anything with you. We need to be careful to do what we know to do unto others as we would want someone to do to us. We're to become like Christ and to be moved with compassion for others. He had compassion on the widow whose only son had died. Being a widow was difficult enough, but without her only son's help, her life would have been very hard indeed. This incident is reported in Luke 7. Let's turn there and begin reading in verse 12. Luke 7, verse 12. And when he came near the gate of the city, behold, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. When he saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her, "Do not weep." I imagine that one reason that Christ had compassion for the widow is because he could imagine what her life would be like without her son. Who would have looked after her after he was gone? Continue in verse 14. Then he came and touched the open coffin, and those who carried him stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And he who was dead sat up and began to speak. And he presented him to his mother. Sympathy, remember, would have had him feeling sad for the widow. Empathy caused him to do something. And in this case, it was in his power to bring him back to life. In Matthew 4, verses 23 and 24, we see more examples of his compassion. Matthew 4, verse 23. Now Jesus went about all Galilee, teaching in their synagogues, preaching the gospel of the kingdom, and healing all kinds of sickness and all kinds of disease among the people. Then his fame went throughout all Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Although healing the sick and others with various afflictions was not the primary purpose that Christ came to earth, when he had the opportunity to help others, he didn't refuse. And Jesus even cried for Jerusalem. Let's look at Matthew 23. Matthew 23, verse 37. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate. One thing that occurs to me out of this is that Jesus didn't withhold his concerns for them just because they were doing things to bring about their own troubles. Some people have very little sympathy, let alone any empathy, for people when they're going through trials. They actually can feel that somebody deserves their problems. Well, yes, sometimes we bring on our own problems. But what if God said the same thing about us? It was compassion that caused God to send Christ into our world. It was compassion that caused Christ to die for our sins. It was compassion that caused him to care about what was going to happen to Jerusalem. How can we build this kind of active compassion that Christ had? Well, we can avoid self-righteous attitudes. We can't condemn someone because of his or her circumstances. God has called people in nearly every circumstance. And even if someone's trial is self-inflicted, we should put ourselves in that person's situation. Sure, he or she may have caused that problem, but now they're suffering. Think about the pressures and sorrow the person is under. How would you feel if that was you? We can build on the compassion that God gives us through his Spirit. God's Spirit prompts us with feelings of concern and the desire to help others. We want to make sure we do not ignore or squelch those feelings. We can do what we can to help physically, even if that is limited to uplifting conversation. Yes, involvement takes effort and time. Perhaps more importantly, it takes selfless awareness of other people. It presupposes wisdom, since we need to know how to involve ourselves in others' problems. We need to remember how do they want to be helped, not just what we think they want. The point is that empathy and compassion can be learned and can be put into practice. Put into practice now in so many ways. And a lack of compassion can be real dangerous to our own spiritual health. Years ago, one of my favorite columns from the Worldwide News was Dexter Faulkner's column. It was entitled, "Just One More Thing." In one issue, he was addressing the topic of conversation. He asked, where does it come from, this capacity to share another's grief or feel another's pain? Let's think about the Good Samaritan for a minute. What made the Samaritan respond when other travelers simply walked on by? One of the primary character traits that made the Samaritan the way he was empathy. In addition, he was in the habit of helping. Through the years, he had trained himself to respond to others' needs by the endless repetition of small efforts. While some of us may have just passed by the man, many of us may have had the reaction like the young lady in this following account. A Sabbath school teacher was telling her class the story of the Good Samaritan, in which a man was beaten, robbed, and left for dead. She described the situation in vivid detail so her students, remember young kids, so her students would catch the drama. Then she asked the class, if you saw a person lying on the roadside, all wounded and bleeding, what would you do? One little girl broke the hushed silence. I think I'd throw up. Yes, this is humorous, but empathy is something that can be practiced by people of all ages. Children can feel empathy for a classmate who gives the wrong answer or mispronounces a word when they're first learning to read. They can put themselves in that classmate's shoes because they've probably been there themselves. With their parents' help, even young children should be able to learn empathy. If we agree to get our child a pet, we need to take the responsibility to make sure that the pet is taken care of properly. A child can learn to think of the pet's needs and help meet some of them. Older folks can have empathy for their fellow senior citizens who are beginning to experience limitations, and not by trying to outdo each other by list of complaints, but by encouraging each other and maybe sharing some funny comments or joking about their infirmities. Empathy also means not coming to church when you're sick, because you don't want anyone else to feel as bad as you did. Back in 2003, we received a letter from a person in Temple Terrace, another resident in Temple Terrace. He explained in his letter, approximately 30 years ago, I had a personal experience with the flu that I will never forget. I made a personal vow that I would get a flu shot every year without fail, and I have done so. The enclosed article provides me with an opportunity to advise literally thousands of people in this regard. Now, the letter said a whole lot more than that, but the point was, because of his own experience with the flu, He was willing to spend thousands of dollars to send this letter to every resident in Temple Terrace to make sure they had that newspaper article in their hands. He did not want anyone to suffer the flu the way he had. Empathy means that you're glad when you hear improvements are made in someone else's life. Empathy is sitting nice at church so that you don't distract the speaker or forget the speaker, the person next to you. If you're sitting there, never taking any notes, never opening your Bible, chewing gum, passing notes to others, playing games on a device, you're sending a message not only to the person on stage, but the people around you. Our body language communicates empathy, or the lack of it. In a recent study of U.S. presidents by the Harvard Business School, empathy was one of the 5 character traits and skills that they found was shared by the most effective presidents. The author of this article, Terry Felber, was the author of another article, Am I Making Myself Clear? And he mentioned that empathy is a character trait that everyone can possess and use. He wrote, it requires little except our ability to see situations, conversations, and relationships beyond how they impact us. In other words, to care about others. He went on to give a few suggestions for showing empathy in our day-to-day lives. I'll mention a few of them. He says we should never be unnecessarily correct. If someone is telling us a story and brings up facts that we know that are wrong, we need to fight the temptation to point it out to him in public. As long as no one is going to get hurt by the wrong information, save the correction for later and in private, just the way you would want to receive it. And the second point he made, whenever possible, ease awkwardness. Try to make an uncomfortable moment easier for a person who has stumbled, especially if it's a result of their lack of preparation. And we should do it inconspicuously if possible. He wrote, you will win people for life if they know you're willing to protect their dignity in front of others. Now, those are obviously just 2 small examples of the many that he gave, but it points out that empathy is something that we can practice in every portion of our lives. As his first point implied, one thing we can do is ask ourselves the following question. Is it about me, or what I can do, or what can I do to serve this person? In other words, would you want to correct the person for the benefit of them or to make ourselves look good? Empathy means you esteem others better than yourself. It means not bragging or tooting your own horn. One of the key tools for developing empathy is to just listen. The key to good listening is to stop talking. One reason we sometimes talk rather than listen is we may not want to hear about the other person's problems. Maybe sometimes that's because we think we have enough of our own. And sometimes we feel that we're going to be obligated to do something to help the other person. Often, all a person really wants is to have someone that is willing to listen to them. And we need to listen without thinking about what else we should be doing, or where we're going to go for our next meal, or how we should answer or correct the person. We've often read the scripture, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. Perhaps if we're listening with our heart, we'll be given the answer that we need, if we need one at all. Sometimes just letting a person talk is all the help that they need. When we do listen, we need to show that we've heard. It means we need to be careful that we don't respond inappropriately. It'd be better to say nothing than to hurt or offend somebody. Empathy means, as I mentioned earlier, you don't quickly jump in with a comment, "I understand," unless you do completely understand because you've been through the exact same situation. You know what it feels like to have someone do that to you, so we should refrain from doing that to others. It's especially insulting if you use those words to someone and then go to show by your words and actions that you didn't have a clue, you just didn't want to listen. If we say, "I understand," and they're just words, we're going to destroy that person's trust in us. And trust is a key component of empathy. One indication of compassion is prayer. We can examine our prayers for outgoing concern for others. God loves intercessory prayer. He delights in answering the prayers that we send up for others. Why? He loves to see unity, love, and concern grow in the church. What God sees is our emotional attachment to others. How much empathy or compassion we have for the suffering of others affects the fervency and zeal with which we yearn for Jesus Christ to return, and that will end the world's suffering. Soon we'll be picturing the world tomorrow. Can our empathy for others help us see why we have to get ourselves ready and make sure that we're not delaying the return of Christ? The world doesn't have any idea what it needs, but we do. Empathy is real compassion, the kind that Christ had when he lamented over Jerusalem. It's the kind of compassion we have to have when we sigh and cry for the nations. It means caring what other people think or being sensitive to make sure we don't offend them. We might be right, but if it's upsetting to someone else, a person with empathy does not care. A person with empathy does care and refrains from doing what may occur to them. In 1 Corinthians 8, Paul explains that not everyone has the same understanding. In this particular case, some of the members of the church understood that to eat meat that had been offered to idols was no big deal, since they knew that idols were nothing. His point was that just because it wouldn't bother them to eat the meat, if there was someone that it would bother, they should refrain from eating it. For us, it might be how we dress. We might not think there's anything wrong with the way we dress, but a compassionate person refrains from dressing the way they want because they are aware that it might offend or upset someone else. A Christian is not one who's simply waiting around for his or her own reward. We should be actively preparing for the kingdom of God to come. One way that we can do that is by practicing empathy. Compassion is part of God's nature, so naturally he wants us to be developing it too. Romans 12, which is often described as the Christian living chapter, is filled with practical instructions for caring, compassionate Christians. We can live this chapter now and be learning a trait that God will have us extend to every human being in the world tomorrow. We need to pray for the ability to add the skill of empathy to our character so that we'll take it with us into the world tomorrow and be more able to help others when we are in the kingdom. I'd like to close with 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, verse 8. Paul wrote, "Finally, all of you be of one mind, having compassion for one another. Love as brothers. Be tender-hearted and courteous." That sounds like good advice for all of us.